And he later wrote the Poetry of Architecture, which looked at how buildings, particularly homes, should rest harmoniously in their environment and use local materials. How was this thread that went throughout his later work developed?
Well, interestingly enough, actually, the Poetry of Architecture was the first book. In fact, it was a series of articles that he began to publish in a magazine. It only emerged as a book much later in his life. Basically, he became interested in architecture for two reasons. One was it was a natural extension of his interest in visual culture. Secondly, it came at a time when the revival of Gothic architecture was underway. Now, Ruskin, being an evangelical Protestant, was deeply worried by the fact that the person who was actually leading this revival, a man called Pugin, was an Englishman, but his father was French, and Pugin was a Catholic convert. And what Ruskin was particularly anxious to do was to, as it were, reclaim Gothic architecture for Protestantism. Now, that requires a very complicated set of reasoning, but, and Ruskin, I think, never really properly acknowledged the influence of Pugin on his work. But again, he felt that Gothic architecture, which again is like Raphael, it's before the Renaissance, Gothic architecture, which is a Christian form of architecture, as opposed to Renaissance architecture, which is based on pagan, that is to say, Greek and Roman forms, was a more truthful and organic form. And of course, the interesting thing about his whole attitude to the Gothic was that he felt this was an organic form, so that it was closer to nature. Indeed, he said that, in a sense, men turned to Gothic architecture in cities because they'd lost touch with nature, and so Gothic architecture was a way of bringing back organic form into urban life.
It also expressed spiritual values, because architecture was in some ways inseparable from the seven lamps, as it were, the moral categories he thought ought to inform it.
Yes. I mean, the Seven Lamps of Architecture was published in 1849, which is his first big book on architecture. It argues exactly that. Didn't tell you, the Seven Lamps of Architecture doesn't tell you how to build buildings. It tells you how to go about getting yourself in the right moral frame for building buildings. And he says, for instance, that he talks about the lamp of truth, which means you need to be true to materials, the lamp of beauty, which means that you must, obviously it must be beautiful. The lamp of sacrifice, which is very interesting, which talks about the way that we have a duty to make our religious buildings as beautiful as possible, because this is literally a form of sacrifice. And also, crucially and very interestingly, the lamp of memory, which says that buildings are like books. They are our memory. And they must be truthful, and they must be preserved as they are.
And in 1835, Ruskin visited Venice and described it as the paradise of cities. What moved Ruskin about Venice, and how has he influenced how people see the city?
Well, of course, in 1835, Ruskin is 16, so he's a young man. He's full of reading a lot of Byron, and Byron had lived in Venice not long before. And, of course, Venice at that stage is like anybody who's never been to Venice before. It is the most amazing place to see, because, for instance, in those days there was no connection by land between the central part of Venice. There was no railway bridge. So you arrived hot and dusty from in a stinking old coach before the railways, and you get off and you get into this extraordinary black gondola, and you're rowed across the water to this miraculous place, which, unlike cities elsewhere in Europe, was not surrounded by walls and fortresses and guards. It didn't need that, because it was there in the centre of the lagoon, and it rises up. And there is not just the classical city, which most people thought of, the city, the Renaissance city of Palladio and so on. Also, there was the most beautiful Gothic city. So Venice becomes like a a little place of experiment, because Venice had once had a great empire, and where was Ruskin from? From England, which of course was in the process of making a great empire. So he saw in the rise and fall of Venice a kind of paradigm for the rise and fall of empires. And he said, when he wrote The Stones of Venice, when he opens The Stones of Venice, the first volume in 1851, he says, Venice fell, and if Britain does not get itself together, Britain too will fall. And he was right.
And his book on Venice Stones contains an attack on capitalism and the division of labour. How did this make him influential amongst socialist thinkers of the time?
Well, The Stones of Venice is actually in 3 volumes, and the first volume is describes sort of is a theoretical description of what architecture should be like. So it's a kind of continuation of the 7 lamps of architecture. He then, in the second 2 volumes, he then describes the history of Venice through its architecture. But the more he thinks about the architecture, he thinks about the people who made it. And by that he doesn't mean architects, he means the stonemasons, he means the artisans. And of course this is at a time in European history when we've just been through the year of revolutions in 1848. The whole of Europe is rocked by various forms of uprising. In Britain, the 1840s were known as the Hungry 40s, so it had been a period of great social unrest. And in a wonderful chapter, which kind of steps outside of the book, steps outside of history and writes, it's called The Nature of Gothic. And it's not a historical chapter, it's a historical about what is the essence, what is the moral essence of this thing called the Gothic, which he says isn't a pointed arch or a particular form of column or something. It's a combination of certain moral qualities. And he says that the point about Gothic architecture is that in Gothic architecture, the work may be rough, but the workman is free. Whereas in now industrialized society, the workman is a slave to the machine. And that, of course, is profoundly influential, and of course is almost exactly contemporary.
People like William Morris and...
Well, William Morris and people read that as undergraduates, but this is exactly contemporary with Marx. And although Ruskin and Marx never met, and Ruskin was always a conservative, and Marx was obviously a revolutionary, when they came to discuss the nature of labour, they both say that man's labour is stolen. Marx says that man's labour is stolen in terms of the monetary value of his labour. Ruskin says that man's labour is stolen in its creative sense, so that men become slaves because they're no longer creative. And really,
they no longer have creative potential.
Yes, exactly. And he says every person is a creative person, but industrial society stops that.
When Turner died, after initially declining, he became the executor of his will and worked on the 20,000 works left to the National Gallery. How did that change his view of Turner?
Well, I have to correct you. Actually, what happened was that Ruskin was an executor of Turner's will, but actually resigned because the will was very complicated. Nonetheless, in spite of having resigned as an executor of the will, when he discovered that all the works that were had been mouldering in Turner's studio and so on, were handed over to the National Gallery and were just left lying in heaps and rags, he started to restore them and select them and so on. And actually it meant that he got, for the first time, since things like slide collections, all those things didn't exist, he was able to go through the whole of Turner's works. And in fact, his view of Turner changes because he sees that Turner is a much more tragic figure than he thought, and he sees that Turner had a private life, had a sexual life, of which he Ruskin had been previously unaware, and I think that darkened, as it were, his picture of Turner.
Is it true that he destroyed the erotic paintings that Turner produced?
If it's true that Ruskin destroyed the erotic drawings, how is it that we still have these erotic drawings? This is something I've never understood. It's a very complicated story, and it is possible, for reasons, for instance, of the passing of the Obscene Publications Act, just as Ruskin finishes his work, and therefore technically the National Gallery could have been in trouble for having these supposedly erotic pictures, though the ones that I've seen are not particularly exciting in my view, certainly nothing to what we see today. It is complicated, and if he did so, in fact, it wasn't him, it was actually the keeper of the National Gallery who lit the match.
Yes, out of fear.
Yes, out of fear, and of course they saw themselves as protecting Turner's reputation. But they obviously didn't do it very well, because there are a number of erotic drawings which we know are by Turner and which, I've shown in an exhibition.
Why did he launch the Guild of St George, and what did that set out to achieve?
After 1860, Ruskin becomes less interested in art in itself and much more interested in society. And having made all these arguments about the nature of labour and the need for a creative life and so on, what he does is he forms, in the 1870s, a kind of utopian society which would own land in order to protect it, and this is the beginning of the ecological movements and the National Trust. All those things really do begin there. A utopian society in which people would work without steam machinery. I think they would have been allowed electricity because it could have been created by water mills and things like that. And the idea was that this would be a utopian society where people would live in proper relation to the land, growing their own food, but also being taught, learning, studying. There were libraries, and indeed the one thing that survives of the Guild of St George, apart from one or two small holdings which still exist and are still being worked and are still being farmed, was a museum which he created in the industrial town of Sheffield. And he did that because he wanted the ordinary workmen of Sheffield to have access to art in a way that the middle classes did, but the working classes were not encouraged to have.